We can start the meeting. First of all, just some quick update on the. We are going to finally update the working group lead. So I see Erica joining the Kubernetes org, and also Robert is in the process of joining the Kubernetes org. I think after you guys joined, they can update the working group leads eventually. Robert, can you talk about the security audit for the cloud custodian?
And I think we have Kapil on, who's from Cloud Custodian, but the process in SIG security is being queued up.
Okay.
I've volunteered to participate. I'm also leading the Falco assessment, so I won't have time to lead the Cloud Custodian, but I can participate. But I think there have been a number of folks who have raised their hand. That said, I did email you and Erica. Not sure if either of you want to volunteer as lead, or if you know folks who want to volunteer as lead, but currently we need a lead. So that's I would characterize that largely as an administrative role.
Okay.
It can be as hands-on technical as they want, but really, the way OPA ran, I think the lead is primarily just to make sure that everybody's on task and participating and getting the inputs they need. So I mean, this is the Falco one would be only the third assessment, so nothing is set in stone. And then the Cloud Custodian would be either 4 or 5, depending on. I think Spiffy Spire might get in there ahead of Cloud Custodian, or work in parallel. So. So if anyone on the call or anyone in your network would be interested, I think we'd love to have someone participate as lead.
Erica, are you?
Hey,
yeah.
I'm debating.
Hey, I'll just...
Yeah, go ahead, Kapil.
Yeah, I was just saying, I guess I can do that. I see no reason I shouldn't be able to. I will have your email to read more thoroughly and make sure I understand the implications, but I can raise my hand.
That would be awesome. I was just curious as far as, like, how did things work with OPA or Tough or any of the other projects that have gone through the process? Is it like just do comments on the docs, or is it like setting up like a meeting just to work through questions?
So I wasn't directly involved in the Tough, though. I did kind of observe the Justin Kappas, Justin Cormack, and then Sarah and Dan, their kind of feedback on the process. I think the reality is that the Tough was really just the very first iteration. Nobody really knew what it should be, what it wanted to be, whatnot, and so it was just kind of a brainstorming process more than anything, is kind of my takeaway. But that said, again, I was directly involved in the OPA process. And so I can, and actually, interestingly enough, from both sides, because I happen to be geographically close to the Stira team. So I had a chance to meet in the Stira office with Ash, who is the OPA representative, and then of course was volunteering on the SIG side, and of course declared that not real conflict, but just that entanglement. So it was clear to everyone that I was kind of had a foot on both sides. So I can speak, with some experience on how things looked from each perspective. Again, it was only the second iteration, so there was more process defined but there wasn't a lot. And the primary process was really just Ash filling out the self-assessment, and then everybody reviewing that self-assessment and kind of having a few Zoom sessions, if you will, to ask Q&A. And then, you just got progressively, drilled down into the more technical details of the threat model and, what are some of the mitigation suggestions that the SIG had. And then OPA would respond with either specific changes. I think they did file a few GitHub issues on the OPA project, and I believe some of those were pretty quickly implemented. And then I think there were some that are kind of still open and more philosophical. I think I would bucket the discussions into two groups. One was more like, what's the configuration? Is it secure by default? And then the other is, just what's kind of the threat attack model that is in scope for an operator, and versus just kind of more theoretical stuff that maybe would be of interest down the road. And so I think where things were very clearly not secure by default, I think OPA was fairly agreeable to make those changes. I think where things kind of went off into the weeds a bit of a hypothetical case, or maybe might happen somehow threat, I think that's where OPA kind of pushed back a little bit, and rightly so, said, look, these are interesting scenarios, but at some level the operator has to take some responsibility for what they're installing and how it's configured. So I think the middle ground compromise was, what should the project do to make it easier for someone to default install securely, and what kind of documentation can they provide around that, and then educate the operator community about how to do that well. So very collaborative from both perspectives. I myself, working with Ash on the kind of prep side, suggested early on that we just review the CII guidelines. These are just kind of some basic, I would say, good hygiene practices around the capabilities of the team, and the policy documentation around the project. So if it was I think Ash could speak for himself, but I think he asserted openly that it was a good preparatory step for him to go through those again, and make sure that what they had attested to in the CII checklist was A, accurate, and B, was being maintained. And my personal feedback is, if you do those things, you're pretty good, right? I mean, that's a pretty good baseline. I think beyond that, then it's really that more threat model, secure by default discussion with the SIG reviewers, and I think everybody just kind of brings their own perspectives to that. But I think if you follow the CII practices and really do implement them, you're in a pretty good position to start from. So that's. I wonder if that
Thank you. That's super. Yes, that was a thorough and very useful answer. Lots of additional context. Yeah, the CII stuff is I think all this best practice for open source projects. I think we've got all of them nailed except for, of course, the security contact or security submission process, but that's relatively light lift. And then with regards to threat models, yeah, I'm assuming baselining of if you have write access to the file system binary code, then game over. And if you have write access to the policies that you're executing, game over. Beyond that, I think the rest of it is relatively straightforward to address and clarify. But yeah, I was questioning. The question I had was more specifically around there's not. Did you discuss those in the SIG meetings, or did you sort of hold up a separate meeting based on a lot of feedback on the documents? And if I'm holding up this SIG from any agenda items, then we can continue, and I'll table that for a Slack discussion.
Just a quick response. All the review discussions were in separate meetings, and I can't remember if they were just open, just on a different Zoom conference line, or if they were closed to just the reviewers. I think they might have been closed just to the reviewers and the project team initially. But anyway, so yeah, I'll hand it back over to the main agenda. But yeah, it'll be a separate session.
Thanks.
Okay. So shall we move on to the next topic?
Sure.
Chief, can you share the screen?
Yeah, sure. I think sharing would be going in first.
Yeah, I'll share my screen.
Okay.
Okay. So I guess I'll give you a quick updates about the kernel, what we've been working on and what we will be working on. And also Shiv will give you a updates about the policy violation CRDs as last time we discussed. How we can like better extract the interface for the reporting mechanism. So first, we had a GA release in the early December. Just to quickly recap for what kernel does, it is a policy management tool which helps you to enforce best practices or the configurations of your workloads. And we're working on two Kubernetes CRDs. One is policy, another is policy violations. Once you have a policy deployed to your cluster, the kernel will apply the policy to your resource and the violations are reported. And a policy can have a validate, mutate, or generate rules, which works on any kinds of Kubernetes resources, including CRDs. So you can define the resource block in the validate or mutate rule to filter on the resource, whether it's by kinds, names, or the label selectors, or there's we saw there's a request that you want to apply the policy based on the user info, of the incoming request, and to decide whether this policy should be applied or not, right? And for these namespace policy violations, we have make it a separate policy violations as cluster violations, because whenever you have a namespace administrator, we want them to have access to the policy violation so that they can know what kind of alarms are generated for your namespace workloads, right? And also we introduced the status reporting mechanism for the webhook status. We will keep verifying if the webhook is healthy or not, or it's enabled or not, so that the user can better know the kernel is actually functionality at the admission webhook or not, right? And for these scalability improvements, we have been decoupled the report mechanism from the webhook. One is we introduced the policy store to faster retrieve the policies, and also we separate the reporting logic from the webhook, which is to report the violations and the events. Okay, so those are the features we had for the GA, and also we have a lot of feedbacks from communities, and these are the features we're going to focus on for the QA release. The first one is, so currently one kernel rule can apply to several kinds of resources, but if you have a pod and also a pod controller, so you have to write two separate rules so that you will cover all kinds of resources. But the user has to write those two kinds of rules, which might be difficult for them to manage. So we decided if kernel can automatically generate the rules for pod controllers, that will kind of simplify the like when you write the policies, you can only write the policy on pods, and we will cover the rest case. And also for the variable substitutions, so based on the admission request, we can extract those data from the request, whether it's an object or the user info. Then we can substitute the context in the policy. Or you can query the existing cluster resources to do some basic substitutions. For the generate and synchronize, so kernel currently watches for the namespace creation to do the generate, whether it's generating a new Kubernetes resource or clone from the existing resource. But this only works on the namespace creation, right? So we've seen a lot of requests say that they want to generate on different kinds of resources. So we think that would be super helpful if we have if we can work on different triggers for the generate rule. And for the namespace policy, since all the policy we have for now is cluster-wide resource, a tenant admin or the namespace administrator may not have the access to those policies. So if with these namespace policies, a tenant admin should be able to create or delete or operate on those kind of policies, right? And also we allow the users to control over the checks for existing resource. Like you can define whether to auto-generate the policies, or you can, based on the existing resources, the user has to control for those policy scope. Okay, and let me explain in detail for some of the features we are working on. First one is the auto-generate policy on pod controllers. So you can see we have two separate rules. The first one is applied to pod, and the second is applies to pod controllers. So this is how you're gonna write the policies now. If you wanna cover the bare pods as well as the pod controllers, you have to define these two separate rules, which could be difficult for you to manage. And also for an incoming request, let's say you deploy an deployment, but you only have a policy on pod. So in this case, we will not return immediately. So you don't know if your policy is applied or not, or fail or success. You have to check deep to see if this pod is created or if there's any violations are created, because we don't apply the policy on pod controller, right? So to solve that scenario, if you have a policy on pod, say the user have this policy on pod, and kernel sees there's a request, say this policy is applied on pod, and we will automatically generate an additional rules to apply this policy on pod controller. So whenever you try to deploy a stateful set, let's say, you will get immediately response. Like if you have an enforce policy, the request is blocked immediately. So you'll know what happened for this particular policy. And also we give you the ability to whether turn off or select the controllers you want this policy to apply with. This is the annotation field for a policy. So you can whether define a set of controllers or to just put a none or remove this annotation from your policy, so you can control the behavior of the policy of this feature. Okay, and for the variable substitutions, we saw there's a use case come from the community that, so basically this is the policy that works on this is a generate policy. So what they request is whenever they have a CRD come in, new CRD come in, they want to generate some kind of cluster role based on the resource state, based on the data in this CRD resource, right? So you can see whenever there is a CRD, they want this metadata.name comes from the spec names.kind with this followed whatever strings or the suffix. And for this API rules, they want the spec groups to substitute in the generated resource. So basically, this variable substitution works on the admission request, or we can query some existing resource. We can query the data from the existing resource.
Just to add one more point to the querying, the whole idea is we're not introducing anything new. It's just you give us a JSON and then you define a JSON JMES path and you can refer to it. So it's kind of leveraging the JMES options that is already there.
Right. Okay, as I described before, this generate works on the namespace creation, but also it can clone the existing data from your cluster. But later, it would be useful if the generate rule can be triggered by various resources or the CRDs, right? And if the resources are cloned from another namespace, we want to synchronize those data across the namespace. And with this namespace policy, so you can write a policy in any namespace, and this policy will only apply to this namespace objects. And more useful for a multi-tenancy environment, you have a namespace and administrator could create or delete or operate those policies. Again, for the controllability, we allow the user to, whether you want to generate the rules for pod controllers, or you can, based on the admission control request data, to control what are the policies can be applied to resources. Okay, and let me give you a quick demo about how the user info filters works. So let's say we have two different users. One is cluster administrator and another is a tenant admin. So based on these subjects in the matched block, I'm trying to say this policy can only apply to the service account with this name and in this namespace, right? So this is to check the security context run as non-root user. So let's first create the deploy kernel. Again, it's some single YAML. You can just use kubectl create, and it'll bring up kernel in your cluster. And then let's deploy this policy. Say kubectl create. Sorry, different. Kubectl create NSF. Okay, so you can say this policy, I define the failure action as in false, which means if I have a pod without the security context, it'll block the resource creation for this particular user with this service account. Okay, so I'll first show you if I'm a namespace administrator, what will happen. So with this kubectl config current context, right? So now I'm a namespace administrator, and if I try to apply, let's first take a look at the pod manifest. This is a simple pod without the security context defined, which means this policy will apply to this resource. So when I try to create this resource, we will see kubectl. We will see our creation will immediately till they blocked by kernel. But if I create this pod as a cluster administrator, current context, right? As a cluster administrator, you see the pod is created. Demo pod, but in this case, you should get a namespace policy, namespace policy violation. I'm just trying to filter based on the label selector. Default. Right, you'll see there's a violation reported on this pod. Okay, this is the simple demo I have. And Shiv, if you want to switch, take over.
Sure. Okay, I guess we can have the discussions after the CRD. Once we discuss the CRD idea, so let me just get it on. Just a second. Apologies. Okay, awesome. All right, so okay, so the idea behind the whole discussion is, as we saw in the demo, that shouldn't had anything that's been violated or anything that's incorrect. We have a CR that's created, which lets you know if things correct or what something's broken, what needs to be corrected. And the reason for this discussion or this document is if we can define standardized way to define these violations, it would allow us to kind of integrate any policy engine, because every policy engine or every kind of policy management framework could follow this directly or working through adapter. And when it comes to using it or integrating these tools, it just makes it simple for the cluster operator. They don't really have to understand APIs for each. So as we know, there's many policy management tools which offer variety of features, Parker, Gatekeeper, OPA, Kyverno, and Krail as well.
Hey Shiv, can you increase the width of the document?
Oh yes, sorry. Okay, awesome. I hope that's better. All right. All right, so getting back to the discussion. So yeah, what the idea is, if we can have a CRD, but we don't really want to specify how do you specify, but just like a general metadata. So this is going to, the CR is going to store the metadata with all the specific information out there. Now, just recapping a bit, when is a violation actually created? It's like if your policy blocks a resource, or if it allows a resource, but it kind of needs to show you a warning saying something needs to be corrected. So it's running in an audit mode. Now, the other thing is when someone goes and corrects the policy, then it should be seen that the CR is gone. So there's nothing active. So an active violation is what we have. Now, again, when you come to a policy, two important information, we need the resource. So which specific resource does this correspond to? We as normally API version kind name is there, but now when it comes to namespace, it again depends on if for example, in Kyverno, if you are using a namespace policy, you would have your resource for a namespace resource, your violation would be created in that specific namespace. Similarly, for a cluster-wide resource, the resource would be a cluster-wide resource. Now, policy, just an identifier to identify the message. For example, like a message from the policy saying that the non-root user is not allowed. Now, again, this will be engine specific. The message could be a string, or it could just be a simple interface, which can be deserialized to understand whichever policy engine's been used. And the other important factor I feel is the status. So we sort of track of a history of when was this policy created, store information about which user was responsible so that we can notify them, and also if it's a create, update, and how things are happening. And again, it's the life cycle is purely managed by the policy engine, the creation, updates in case something's corrected, or deletion if the policy or even the resource is being deleted. So now I'm going to just open up the discussion to give some feedback about how everyone feels about having a specific CRD like this to just store the meta information while having which can be leveraged by all the policy engines. So yeah, I would just kind of open it up for everyone now.
Sure. So some questions. How closely does this align with the CRDs or exist that certain policy enforcers already have? Were there differences or certain information that's not in this proposal that is on other ones?
Well, honestly, like from what I've like most of these plugins that we have are leveraging the admission webhook. So if there's some kind of a rejection, your response is what you get your rejection is in. But if you're running in an audit mode, if, for example, in Kyverno, we'll allow it, but then we have the CR. But honestly, we still have to kind of get into more detail about the other policy engines.
Yeah, so most of the other policy engines are not creating a resource to track the violation, right? So like Falco just has a webhook receiver, or you can get this in logs or events or things like that. I don't think Gatekeeper has anything either in terms of creating a violation as an actual Kubernetes resource. So this is where I invited Rita and Michael from the Falco project and others to take a look and comment on this, but we haven't received any feedback. But the intent is, we want to make this, of course, generic enough where any policy engine can use this, and then you have common reporting and management tools for the violation itself.
Do any such tools exist today, and are we defining common metadata fields on the CRD?
I'm sorry, Kapil, I couldn't follow the full question. Can you repeat, please?
Sorry, I'm in a noisy place. Are there any metadata tools that are we defining any metadata formats as part of the CRD? Are there any tools that report on those? I'm just trying to understand what's the value chain to a reporting tool because it's already doing custom integration for each of these as a one-off without a defined metadata spec, which does not exist as far as I can see.
Right. Yeah, so obviously in Kyverno, like what Shooting just went over earlier, we've implemented a Kubernetes resource because the whole intent, the philosophy behind Kyverno is to make everything Kubernetes native, right? We're not creating external reporting tools, etc. So the policy resource here could be something that Kyverno could adapt to. It's different just to make it generic, but it would not be a problem to adapt anything coming out of Kyverno in terms of violations. For OPA Gatekeeper, Falco, and even K-Rails, I think they would have to if they are able to create these resources, the immediate benefit is that the cluster admin through a single kubectl command can see violations from any tool, right? So that's the first benefit. And then if we create some common machinery to, even if we want to build other reports or compliance over time type of tools, those could be done in a common fashion. And those were some of the reasons what we had discussed a few meetings ago, right, is potentially starting to standardize around these policy engines. So even if the implementations and the triggers are very different, at least there's some commonality that the cluster operators could benefit from. Does that make sense?
It does. Have any of their projects that you're listing out here been approached as far as what they think of it?
No, we haven't received any feedback so far. So yeah, I think maybe if some of the other work group members have direct contacts, would be good to solicit feedback and see what the other engine maintainers and other projects think about doing something like this. I mean, do folks on the call? I mean, do we still think it's a good idea
I'm
to
still in
do?
favor, especially as a starting way to possibly like even enable report only mode for pod security policies and
Right.
start moving forward with the future of that.
Sorry, you said cloud security. Did you mean Kubernetes, or was there another intent?
No, yeah, Kubernetes.
But you were talking about pod security.
Pod
specifically.
security, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, my bad.
Did I say something?
Yeah, sorry. No, that's my own bad hearing at the moment. I heard cloud. I think it makes sense, like the value chain you articulated as far as commonplace. Totally makes sense. I think that the question to me would be trying to get like at least one Kubernetes native, to use that parlance, dashboarding tool, be it the GUI or the console, having some capability around this would also be nice, because I don't know what it means to say Kubernetes native as a CRD, which no one's looking at.
Guess that would be
Right.
not custom resource, just a resource definition. But yeah.
So yeah, I think it would be nice to talk to the dashboard team to see if they'd be as well interested in trying to at least give a raw rendering. It might be worth also taking it a step further and seeing if there's any notion of some common metadata fields here that will and then allow for extensions on top of that, as opposed to just saying it's more of a blob. That becomes a little bit more unclear. It sounds like you've got location specifier as far as the origin, but it might be nice to dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. There's all information, of course, not only on which resource and things like that which are causing the violation, but there could be metadata information, of course, on when it was caused, how many times, just like with events and things like that, right? So the dashboard's a good idea. So if there's I don't know how actively or who maintains the dashboard, but if making this a common object and starting to show policy violations there, then just by running a tool like Falco or Kyverno or any other policy tool, you would start seeing a report quickly of compliance and which workloads are not compliant.
Yeah, I think also having the ability of several of the tools who may be deployed in the same cluster to be able to enrich or chain together these resources or standard formats or standard logs, whatever we end up discussing, so that you get kind of an enriched context for a particular event or a particular period of time.
Right.
You kind of cross-correlate things. That to me is an important use case.
Yeah, that would be interesting. So like if one tool created the violation or reported something, maybe, but through configuration checks and other tools are doing at runtime, to be able to correlate the two.
Right.
Well,
Yeah,
or just having a dashboard of multiple. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say we should be clear that I think that these policy violations are meant to be ones that are tied to Kubernetes objects, so not higher volume than your cluster in general. Because otherwise, you know, we like, I don't know if we at a future point where you have kind of audit sinks where this information kind of goes for long-term storage.
Right.
I have a technical question. Putting the violation in the same namespace as the object seems like that may be a bad idea, as opposed to maybe putting them all in their own namespace. Or I don't know. This kind of brings up some of the multi-tenancy problems.
Yeah, so there
I
are
definitely
some trade-offs.
agree, but I think it's a deployment decision though as well. In the sense that you might want to, and like, you know, yes, it's a best practice, I would think, to put it in a place that it's not tied to it, but at the same time, I think it should have the option to do both, because it's very common to do federated as a security model and very common to centralized.
So Erica, can you elaborate? I'm curious why you think it may not be a good idea.
Well, for instance, I don't want people who have access to a namespace deleting things that they,
Right, okay.
the violations, or necessarily being able to see it. And if they're not allowed to sort of modify or see it, it makes kind of granting access to that namespace much more difficult.
Effectively, the notion is if you compromise the container, then if you're storing it in the container, it's gone. But I think there's multiple models there of what, and I think it's why I think it's a deployment design decision. If you have a centralized pot of gold, then that's where the attackers go. And if that gets compromised, you know, there's different, like you can go sneaker net, like for reasons for that same reason. I think there's different value models and having flexibility around deployment.
Right. So
I suppose another problem also with the namespacing is it seems likely that policy violations may cross namespace, that it's the interaction of a node, which is a cluster level object, with a pod that's namespaced with possibly, you know, network or some kind of, you know, the endpoints, which are assigned to a totally different namespace, etc.
Yeah, so some of the considerations and just kind of trying out different models and seeing what works best in practice. So first off, the violations as they're currently defined in Kubernetes, they match the life cycle of the resource, right? So if you have a pod with a violation, of course, the violations get reported. Then if you delete the pod, the violations will get cleaned up. So they're not meant, like we just talked about earlier, they're not meant for historical tracking. That would be done through events and some, you know, offline tools, which could be collecting these periodically or collecting events and other things. The other consideration was if there's a namespace owner, and more, of course, cluster operators, they want visibility into this, but they don't have the bandwidth or the scale to be able to go and have the namespace, so the resource owners or the workload owners, there needs to be some sort of self-service for them, right? So if these violations are at the cluster level, and if you have a multi-tenant situation, then the workload owner would not be able to see the violations, which seems like a issue, right? Because it would be good for the pod, the person who created that deployment to see what the violations are and to give them a chance to fix it, which is where, I think what we ended up with is, of course, the violations being in the namespace, but with the role-based access control where they would be able to view it, but not delete it. So that concern, of course, is valid, where you don't want a resource owner to be able to go delete the violations. Well, even if they do, it will just get recreated in the next cycle. But even then, like the default rules, the permission set for the violation would be that they can view it, but they can't edit it or delete it. That would be done automatically through the controller.
It seems like a reasonable compromise for the namespace aware boundary being being isolated from the rest of it. So your point about the sort of the audit level of the CRD, like, is there intent to have tooling in this policy stage around that, or in a dashboard integration? Like, I'm trying to understand, like, violations disappearing as, so an attacker hides themselves in a namespace. That's generally not, like, most security audit tools are going to, at least on the big dashboard or red, are going to stay persistent till acknowledged.
Right. So now the question becomes, how much of that do you want to keep in cluster versus outside? So there could be some sort of configuration or default to say that, historical violations, maybe there's a state on them, but they're kept for like a day or a week or some period of time. I would think that it would be, especially if an organization is running several clusters, they would probably want to collect these in some offline database over time and not have them be in each cluster once the violations have been, once the workloads are back in compliance. So it just becomes, some, configuration, some additional configuration we could introduce, which keeps track of when that violation should be cleaned up versus doing it right away. Of course, now if the entire namespace is deleted, that's, again, we're not, even in Kubernetes, even if something's a non-compliant workload and you delete the workload, of course, the resources are cleaned up at, almost immediately.
Makes sense. I guess I'm sensitive, and this is larger, broader philosophy context on what is sort of vendor product versus what's actually Kubernetes native, in the sense of what is helping users get to being more secure. And an audit log as a base Kubernetes native capability would be one of the major reasons I would even look at defining a common format. And if we're saying, well, that's something that needs to be built on the event log and a dashboard that needs to be built on that, and XYZ, and no one actually uses that, then except for doing something that's not in the Kubernetes ecosystem, I'm just trying to figure out. I think there's value chain here. I just want to make sure that we're being clear about articulating what the value chain is in a native way.
Do you have maybe like a series of a couple questions that you could add onto the proposal doc that you think would help, we can fill out and maybe clarify? some of these concerns? Like, would more specific user stories help, or?
I think so. I think if there are, some examples, and again, maybe starting with some of the other projects or the other policy engines where, they're also looking at how to report, I guess, or what the output of a policy engine looks like, starting with them, and if they have also some user case studies for what would want to be seen, because I think there's of course seeing compliance and seeing this current state of the cluster, then there's the history and the audit and knowing things over time, things like that. But really the intent of the initial proposal is just, again, how do you standardize how policy output is reported, versus today it seems like each tool has done something slightly different, right?
Definitely, and I think but that's not the problem you're saying is, and this I think goes to the namespace question that was asked, is being able to attach these in a independent of the object itself, because it's very simple to query a namespace for a CRD, but if the CRD disappears with the object, it's had the life cycle of the object that has value chain, but it means building secondary indexes on event logs and dashboards. And I'd be game to deep dive and explore and see if there's some sort of common tooling that can be built around that. But I think it's worthwhile to support a separate namespace from an audit perspective for the CRDs and joins. Attached to a dummy container, whatever.
Yes, a couple. I think your voice is fading.
Sorry, I was just trying to say that I think it's useful to, I think it would be useful to also explore the CRDs being created in a separate namespace, and then the object lifecycles themselves, just to avoid the additional administrative overhead. Like, complexities could be the enemy of security, frankly, for operators. And it would be nice to see that capability as in a separate namespace with a pointer to the originating violating object as a way of facilitating use cases without additional infrastructure.
Right, so I think that would be up to each policy engine, right? So this is not dictating one style versus the other. This is just saying, here's the format of a violation. And you have the option of creating that in the namespace or creating that as a cluster violation, cluster-wide policy violation. But really that comes down to the implementation of the policy engine and what it's trying to achieve. This is just capturing the definition of what should go in the violation, right? So I think we should kind of separate perhaps the two concerns.
So it's not exactly the same. So I agree, cluster-wide should be in a separate namespace and designated namespace. But even a namespace-specific concerns from a audit, I think audit is fundamental to any notion of security concern and consideration. And ideally, if we're talking like having the ability to have that in a separate namespace, clears away the need to index that separately, and instead it can be presented in a simple pagination UI inside of one of the Kubernetes UIs. So I think even beyond cluster level concerns, that the notion of being able to track CRD independently of originating object has value. please, anyone disagree with me?
I just want to make sure that we get all of this discussion as much as possible recorded somewhere on the doc itself.
Yeah, so maybe the best way to manage that is if you could add comments or questions in the doc, then then we can sort of have a discussion there. Because so maybe Kapil, when you get a chance, if you can add in your comments, questions, or some of the concerns you're thinking of, just let's start using the Google Doc itself to collaborate and iterate.
Sounds good.
And if there's any
Any
suggestions for, like the other sections you mentioned, Erica, even those, maybe if you want to add in a proposal, or if there's folks we need to, invite to take a look and add in their thoughts, let's do that in the document as well.
Okay, will do. And then I think our next meeting will probably be after the break, and then we can make sure to come back to this. So everyone should have their review comments for sure in by then. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that'll be sometime January next year.
Yeah, January 8th, I believe.
Yeah, shall we also ping folks from OPA, like Gatekeeper, K-Rail?
I think that would help. I'm sure.
Okay.
awesome. Then I guess
Yeah, this is a
move.
great proposal. By the way, just quick, the CFP for KubeCon Amsterdam next year. Not sure when the result will be out. Probably, I think
Someone
around
said mid-January.
Yeah. So they can have enough time for visa, etc. Yeah.
I've been talking to some folks just recently, nothing solid, but doing some red, blue team stuff. And I think part of that, obviously, RBAC stuff comes immediately top of mind to those types of scenarios. So, again, whether our original RBAC discussion is accepted or not, I think we can kind of weave in the theme around RBAC policy and how that plays out in a red-blue scenario. So one way or another, I think there'll be some an audience for those discussions and a venue for it.
Yeah, definitely.
I'll just stop the share for now.
Okay. Any other topics, or we can conclude meeting today? Okay, then happy holidays to everyone. See you next year.
Yeah, happy holidays. Take care.
See you next decade. Cheers.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Happy holidays.